how to answer an exam standard question in 10 easy steps. Step 8. What I want to look at now are labour variances. Now, we would expect labour variances to be similar to material variances because, after all, they are both variable costs. If we were to look at the information given in the question, what we want to do is to narrow it down so we have just the labour information. So if we take that labour information, that's all we need to know to do the labour variances. So, I said I wanted it to be similar to materials. And if you remember, the pro forma for materials was standard quantity, standard price, actual quantity, standard price, actual quantity, actual price. Yeah, should be the same. But, we can't really use quantity and price. Let's just try and revise the pro forma slightly. What we have to remember is that we don't measure labour in kilos, which is probably a good thing. And we don't normally talk about the price of labour. So, when we talked about kilos before, we now talk about hours. So, instead of usage, we talk about efficiency. And when we talked about price per kilo before, we now talk about rate per hour. So, we talk about rate instead of price. So, our new pro forma is going to look like this. Pretty damn similar, but we'll have standard hours, standard rate, actual hours, standard rate, actual hours, actual rate. And we have the efficiency and the rate variance. Very easy. So, very similar to materials, let's get going. What we have to appreciate here is that we are given a little bit more information. We were asked in the question to analyse in as much detail as possible. And if you look at what's highlighted in red here, we've made a distinction between the hours paid and the hours worked. Now, if there's a difference between hours paid and worked, what would we call that? That's right, we call it idle time. So what we want to do is we want to separate out an idle time variance. So all we do is this. If you see at the bottom there, where we had actual hours standard rate before, we now separate that into two. The bottom one, we talk about the actual hours paid at the standard rate, because of course the actual hours paid are comparable to the actual hours actual rate at the bottom. Whereas the top one, we have the actual hours worked at the standard rate, because the hours worked relate to the units being produced. And the difference between the two will be the idle time. So not difficult. What I want you to think about these pro formas is that we always use the same pro formas, but we may develop them for a specific need. So, all we have to do is to bash out the numbers in the way that we did before, work from the bottom to the top. I think that the first three are terribly easy. Actual hours, actual rate is given, total actual labour cost. Actual hours paid we know, and we know what the standard rate is. Actual hours worked we know, and we know what the standard rate is. The only thing we have to be slightly careful of is the one at the top, standard hours. If you remember what I said to you, the standard hours relates to the standard hours of the actual output, because we want to compare like with like. So we expected to take 3 hours per unit, and the actual output was 19,200 units. So we bashed them out, and once we've got the numbers on the right-hand side, all we'll do is say top minus bottom, favourable if it's positive, adverse if it's negative, job done. Okay? 5 marks for that. That's immoral. We're living off immoral marks. Amazing, but all I can say is take the marks, please, take the marks. Know your computations. Know your basic computations. If you do know them, you will do well in the exam.